Hey guys, in this chapter we're going to be talking about the Topalov dragon. The Topalov dragon is the improvement over the classical dragon with 1195, where black plays 11, knight takes d4 instead, with the intention of playing pawn to b5. And here, white should not do the typical pawn storm, as he would in a lot of other variations with h4, because after a5, black has a head start. Now this is maybe playable for white, I'm not going to say that it isn't, I wouldn't know, the last time I checked it was really unclear, but I don't want to play this position because black is getting a lot of counterplay really early. And in the consequence of black playing knight takes d4 is that he's improved white's center control. After all, white's now centralized his bishop. So I like to meet b5 with knight d5, and this is a very, very typical way of countering b5s in the dragon, especially when they take on d4 first, exploiting white's center control. Knight d5 aims for exchanges, and then tries to use black's backward e7 pawn. Right now, white's threatening to damage black's structure, so takes. You can take on e5 d5 first. It doesn't really matter. So the gist of it is white's no longer playing for such a big attack anymore, although he can. h4, h5 still exists. There's rook e1 with a backward pawn. There's queen d4. There's better endgames. And black has a lot to watch out for, except that after a5, a3, he can sacrifice a pawn with b4. And that's the key idea of the Topalov dragon. Black can also transpose and play king g8 first, but... So let's talk about the concept here. Concept is, if white's going to target weaknesses in the long run and be objectively better there, probably striking first, black should be willing to give something up in order for white's, in order to get counterplay. And if white takes on b4, then black's plan is to play something like, let's say, how do I illustrate this? I kind of like the idea of rook c8. I don't know the theory here very well. I'm mainly familiar with the ideas. And the queen takes b4 lines. The gist of it is black hopes that lots of open files against the white king are going to offer enough compensation for the sacrifice pawn, and that white won't get a counterattack on the king side in time. And I don't know the status of these lines. For all I know, this is the mainline theory where white's having the best chance to fight for the advantage here. I am not up to date on it, so feel free to look in this direction. But I remember some years ago, I was looking at one of Nxd's books, and he recommended white play h4, and that felt really interesting to me. I like fighting for the initiative. I like fighting for an attack against the king and playing for those weak dark squares. I'm not much interested in pawn grabbing, so I've started playing these lines, and okay, h5. I don't want to spend too much time going into all of this, mostly for two reasons. One of them is I am not an expert on these lines. I got them essentially from Negi with very few improvements. Second of all, queen takes b4 might actually be stronger. And third, I haven't actually checked the lines recently for major improvements. I mean, I quickly checked with the computer to see if there were any blunders, basically, and these lines hold up. But masters aren't going to learn more from this chapter than they will from checking Negi's book, except for maybe they enjoy videos more. So I'm, instead of trying to pretend like this chapter is the most theoretically up-to-date work, I'm going to instead focus on the ideas and trying to explain what both sides are playing for. So black often plays king g8 because white's putting queen d4 with check, or they play king g8 in advance. White is planning to target the weak dark squares. Black intends a counterattack on the c-file. There's ideas like bishop f5 targeting c2. You can double the rooks as well. But as I've already mentioned, I prefer white's chances because black has already weakened the dark squares. And there's ideas like g4 to prevent bishop f5. I really like the idea of king walks, king postulate. I got to do this against Carissa Yip a couple of years ago in Southwest Open. Got quite a good position before blundering maybe one later in a drawn position. So that was a fun game. Okay, typical ideas. And if black plays slowly, there's like rook e1, you target the e7 pawn. There's ideas like rook e1 here. In the long run, white's definitely getting some advantage, because if black doesn't get enough concrete counterplay, there's play on the 7th rank against black's weak bishop and pawn. White's king is more active. In a lot of positions, white has an extra pawn. This is not one of them. You can continue playing on the king side. Generally speaking, when black plays the Topalov dragon, he's hoping to get immediate dynamic counterplay. And if he doesn't get this, then he will still be worse because of his weakness on the king and weakness on e7. Okay, so continuing some theory. After h4, black can also play queen b6, but after exchanging the queens, white gets a better endgame because of black's weak pawns. And also white can activate his king more easily than black can. The road will be a little bit blocked after g4. So let's say rook a8. Well, black's already left the file, so we can afford to take the pawn under better circumstances. Queen d4 check with h5 will be played, and white's just getting a big initiative and having an extra pawn. Okay, same bishop f5, queen takes b4. I'm not saying we don't take this. I'm saying we want to get it under better circumstances. The bishop move is not always the most flexible. Black may prefer to bring the major pieces into the attack. G4 will be coming with tempo, something like this, and black has to retreat, and I mean, white's the one with the initiative and the extra pawn, and the king can be totally safe on the king side, as mentioned already. We're going to bring it to g3 if we want to, but otherwise there's centralization. Okay, c4. There's long and concrete theory. It's crazy. Check the notes if you want to know the details. Long story short, once again, is black is looking for concrete tactics to justify having made this weakness, and white has lots of ways to play that aren't worse. Like you can go for some endgame, you can play different moves. The engine says there are a bunch of 0.00 options. Rook takes d6 exists here. Okay, actually in this position white's winning, but in some similar position black is lost. Sorry, not lost. What am I saying? Okay, sorry. It's been a while since I've reviewed these. That's kind of funny. Sorry. In one position, white plays rook takes h7, and it's part of some crazy draw line. Otherwise, rook takes h7 is a very, very typical tactical idea in order to open the h-file. The idea here in this position is you want to take the bishop with check without the queen being able to recapture. If black took back with his king, you could play rook h1 check, rook h8, and pick up the queen. That's the concrete idea. And, okay, fine, I'll actually slow down. The point behind c4 is he was threatening to take the c2 pawn, and it's protected now. And black has to watch out because white still has all of the usual attacking ideas. Black plays e5 to block the long diagonal. White takes en passant so that the queen can give check without black playing e5. Black takes with the bishop in order to attack the c4 pawn. White gives the check in order to continue the usual plan. Bishop takes c4 is trying to trade pieces for a holdable endgame. Takes g6 tries to offer in-between moves with the threat of checkmate. Black takes back this way in order to defend against something like rook h8 checkmate. Now the queen is defending the h7 pawn. Rook takes. If the king takes, you're losing the queen. If the queen takes, you're losing the bishop with check and everything else as well. White will have a winning position at the end of the line. For example, rook takes c4, queen takes c4, and with the d6 pawn falling, black has a bad position. Okay. These crazy lines can be understood. It's like black is he's desperately looking for counterplay, and he doesn't always get it. Okay, so bishop f5. Okay, the reason we're taking the pawn here is because after bishop f5, he's threatening to take the c2 pawn with a pin. This pawn is a useful attacker. This pawn on b3 is blockading the b4 pawn. So we take it. All right. Countering Nimzovich's all lust to expand with the passed pawns, or maybe that's going a little too far with the concept, but okay. So hopefully these ideas become pretty thematic. The gist of it is pawn storm, dark square weakness on e7, better endgames. We take on b4 under better circumstances. Sometimes there's king walks. And, okay, so let's say they play king g8 immediately, because apparently that's more flexible. Now we'll get back to that. Let's look at queen b6 and other sidelines first. Okay, a bunch of ways to play, but just like, all right, weakness, what you gonna do about it? They can play some move, but then like, these sacrifices are typical, but they just don't work because you have the rook block. The standard rook block Sean Vivert would approve, I hope. Okay, sometimes you apply sun block, then there's the rook block. Definitely, my preference is the rook block. Okay, although I was thinking about buying some sunblock because it's quite hot outside these days. I'll check Kroger later. Anyways, rook c7. Black can try to double up. But this pawn's hanging. This pawn's still hanging. You can exchange the rooks. Oh yeah, hanging with basically checkmate. And then, well, I mean, it's an extra pawn, so b4 doesn't even help because the queen's controlling that. Alright, more unsound sacrifices. Rook e8 allows g4, no bishop f5 for you. Your weaknesses remain on the dark squares. You're still going to get checkmated. There's still the e4, e7 square, or whatever, e7 pawn that's backward. And queen d4 check with slightly better endgames always exists. Some example variations. b4, a4, Petrosian's padlock. We close the position once again. Okay, I love that concept, but I'll get back to that in future courses. e5 takes, well, black just is worse because this pawn is weak, and the queen side's completely closed, and black has no pawn breaks, so in the long run, white just wants to treble up on the file and play h4, h5, and also take e7. Slow down. Slow down. Okay. White's in no rush because black has weaknesses and white doesn't, and so black needs to play concretely immediately if he hopes to get counterplay. So therefore, this move e5 is critical, as played between Anand and Tivakakov, definitely mispronounced his name, with the idea of blocking the long diagonal, preventing endgames with queen d4 check, and white should take because the d6 pawn is now a weakness. Black takes with the bishop because he hopes to capture on b3 in some positions in order to weaken the c2 pawn, but white is still better because black is weak on d6, black is weak on the king side, and white has better center control. Anand went on to win. F5, for example, white has lots of good moves. One of them is h3, just keeping it simple, claiming that black's weakness on e7 and the better endgames aren't going anywhere. Black still needs to prove that he will get counterplay. Rook b8 also exists, but white's plan shows up. We're going to double or triple up against the backward pawn, and black still has weaknesses. Something like b4 can always be met with a4. a4 doesn't help that much because white has good control over the b4 square, so black will not be able to follow up. And after black plays f5, we can just move rook d4, and the general idea is this weakness still exists, the king is still exposed, and white has pawn breaks, as well as a clear target on e7. And so black is going to be defending for a long time. So in conclusion, 16 queen b6 is met with rook e1. This rook move is useful to target the e7 pawn. We're playing for centralization because of black's backward pawn. We have a rook block in case they sacrifice on c2, and black is still defending and still trying to prove that he's in the game. Very common theme for these lines. Black has already created a weakness with this dragon move g6. White has free roll attack or central play, and black is proving that he or is the one who has to prove that he's surviving. And the Topalov dragon is not an exception to that. Okay, so b4 takes, and okay, you can play queen d4. You can take it. I'm just going to stay consistent. My plan is I want to play queen d4. I want to sacrifice, and I want to checkmate you down the h file. Or I want to take and play queen h6. So black has to watch out. The critical move is bishop f5, but let's look at queen a5 first. Queen a5 threatens checkmate in 1, so we can play queen d4. Bishop f5 is the critical move here, but we're going to look at alternatives first. For example, bishop a4, we just get a free roll attack, threatening checkmate in 1, so they take. And I would like you to pause and find the best continuation for white. Okay, hopefully you found it. Rook takes h7, very strong and typical sacrifice. King takes h7, and we just break through. Objectively, this is winning. The king can't move here because we take on f8 with mate in 2. So king g7 instead. And at the end of the line, there's different ways white can play, but at minimum there's a perpetual, and at maximum you liquidate everything with a winning queen endgame due to some extra pawns. The key idea I want to emphasize is rook takes h7 with a breakthrough and black's weak dark squares. Okay, so another alternative is is g5, but that's really weakening, and black's weaknesses aren't going anywhere. We can just improve the king. We have better endgames because of some weaknesses on e7 and on b4, and also there's ideas like h6 and rook e1 in the air. Black is still defending and will be defending for a long time. Bishop f5 also exists, and right now the threat is to play bishop takes c2, and b3. So we escape with the king postulate, king d2. Of course, the king can take care of itself as usual, but not the black king because the dark squares are too bad. I think you can take here too, but king postulate is stronger than pawn postulate. Okay, so there's a few moves. Probably most critical is rook c5. Let's look at rook c5. Yeah, definitely. So let's say rook c7. Well, g4. Your bishop has to retreat, and then you might as well just get checkmated, basically, as we've already looked at. Not to mention the king just improves itself in weakness. Let's see, I think, or even h6. Alpha 0's h-pawn strikes back. No counterplay, no targets, absolutely crushing. Okay, so typical sacrifice should be checked as well. I know this is just all theory, but we have to cover some concrete lines somewhere. It's just an extra exchange in the endgame. Queen c5. Once again, we have better endgames because the king is more active, e7 is a weakness. You're going to bring the rook to the 7th rank. This is a good outpost square on c4. Your king is more active, the bishop is a target, and you can always exchange or play h6. I think my mentor David Milliron liked my highlights on that for the chessable version of the course. So I've been trying to do more of that since he appreciated it. Okay, and more tactics, I guess. Their fake sacrifices don't work because they lose all their pieces and they get pinned. So the idea of bishop c2 is if you take it, then they have a discovered attack. So we don't take it. We just say your discovered attack is going away. And they say we defend our bishop. So if you take it, we'll capture back. But pins are usually pretty good. All right, well, taking on h5 also somewhat makes sense, except now your king is really exposed, and I'm pawn storming you, and my king is safer than yours, and I'm centralized. And yeah, this even goes back to, oh my goodness, why am I remembering Nimzovich and his centralization? But my friend Daniel Gersh also really emphasizes centralization as a key idea for masters becoming stronger, and, well, the king is safe in the center because it's surrounded by his own pieces, I guess. So rook c5 also exists, but, I mean, there's different ways you can play. I like hg6, and then king e3, just sort of saying, well, your weaknesses aren't going anywhere because I have my pawn storm, my queen's centralized, and I have played on the h-file. But my king's actually safe here because the diagonal is blocked by the queen. There's no way to get in through the file. And of course, the king is just strong on e3. Of course. Oh my goodness, when I made this course like 3-4 years ago, or was it longer than that? Of course, I was postulating the king even then. The king postulated apprentice at like, what, 15, 16 years old, and Nagy liked it too, so of course he was strong, so. Alright, so black should play bishop f5, and it's very concrete. Essentially, there's different ways white can play. I'm just going to follow my old theory. Because this is the one line where black has all sorts of concrete counterplay. Not here, because there's just weaknesses everywhere. And the king's going to run, so bishop takes g6, queen takes b4, and I'm going to go, this is the one line, so rook b8 is the most critical, but let's say queen c7, threatening the pawn, king d2, and once again, we have a few ideas. Picking up the bishop, I think, yeah, I think that's right, because on, yeah, I'm just trying to make sure, yeah, there's this check here, different ways to win, but, okay, queen a7, rook e1, preventing queen f2 check because of rook e2. The king is castled in the center. It's protected by the rooks here. Let's make that clear. Okay, so let's say rook c5, rook a1, targeting the queen, and the king is safe in the center. The king is safe in the center. The king is always safe in the center. Sort of. Okay, bishop c2 was in here by accident. I don't know why it's here. Okay, but there's different ways to play. The details of this isn't going to be as interesting for non-masters probably, so I'm just going to go through this pretty fast, and masters can check the theory section themselves, which is essentially Nagy's ideas, honestly, with added notes, and I added a few lines of my own, but I'm talking about the theoretical basis for these recommendations of the h5 are based on Nagy. So, okay, rook b8, queen c3, there's different ways black can play. I don't like queen d4 here. I'm just going to go through this pretty fast. Rook d4 is a good move because you can block with the rook c4, rook c8, bishop c4. Now you're protected. Your queen's still protecting b2. You have all your usual ideas. Your king can go over to the king side. Mostly I just want the rook on d4 also because it prevents queen f2 in a lot of positions so that the king can actually go for a walk. Okay, that's something fresh I like. That's one of the reasons why I like this line so much. The king walks straight into the center and it's totally safe there almost all the time. And in the one concrete line where black is equalizing, this is because he has concrete tactics that barely work against the white king. Now bear in mind, the black king is permanently exposed, and this is just working both in the long run after the king gets to g3, but also in the short term. So black absolutely needs to play concretely or else he's just much worse, if not losing, as usual in the dragon. Okay, so rook a8, and sometimes it just doesn't work. King d2, and there's different ways to play. One of them is like you just keep all your things protected, and you have time to keep improving. White's better. King postulate. Okay, e5, critical, takes, d5, long, complicated tactics. But, okay, it's nonsense. I mean, if you take with the rook, then they have queen f2 check. If you take with the bishop, you're pinned. So that's the whole point of this. Trying to break the blockade, basically. And there's different ways you can play, but I mean, this is one of them, but you know, this is rook sacrifice, rook postulate, right? The king postulate and the rook postulate, right? Of course, they naturally follow each other. And let's say bishop takes is just losing because, you know, naturally your rook goes as far as plausible. Break through, take all his pieces, and then the rook block saves the day once again with tons of discovered attacks, and the queen sacrifice doesn't work. It's just winning, and everything else, your king can just march away if needed. With a completely safe position, the king is completely safe on e3 or f4, obviously, as it should be. And the black king has been walking everywhere, just every day, usual chess. Okay, so f takes e6, king e2, you just go for a little king walk, plus you want to be able to include your rook in the attack without getting hit with queen f2. And your king is off the dark squares now. So let's say he takes you here. Well, then you get checkmated. The other idea is now you're not getting hit with check. So, and let's say he took here. Well, it's basically checkmate after queen f6, and not much he can do. Okay, so king takes h7, rook h4 check, and okay, well, we've already talked about that, and it's the same idea. So once again, I just want to emphasize the key idea of sacrificing the rook on h7 as a breakthrough when the queen is already controlling the long diagonal, because often your other rook can finish the game. But I suppose black can defend sort of with this, well, f6 is best, but let's talk about fe6 first. Well, actually, okay, fine. E5. E5 is the only move, basically, blocking the long diagonal, and all the pieces are hanging, but nothing unusual there, obviously. And then we take, check, and everything's confusing, but mostly it's okay. And we have 4 pawns for the piece, but maybe black can hold. I don't know. That looks pretty good for me. Mostly I'm just happy that the kings were walking all around the board, and white's was stronger. Okay, so f6. Once again, blocking the long diagonal. This goes back to international master Yakov Norowitz's color theory about dark rebuild. Okay, so rook h6, bishop f5, f4. We're also doing some dark rebuild, and if it's and we're also including the queen in the attack. So including the rook in the defense. Oh my goodness, the king postulates, then the rook lifts, and oh, this is some fun stuff. And there's a bunch of ways white can play. There's b3, there's e7 mostly, queen e3 maybe, but might as well look at the line. One crazy line. After lots of only moves, there's a perpetual. Perpetual with lots of different ways. You can move here, you can take on f6, you can move there. And if you want to keep the game going, I suppose you can probably play b3 instead with an unclear position. I wonder what's going on here, actually. Well, I'm definitely confused, and hopefully you are too. Wait, what? Well, maybe white's better here. I actually have no idea. I've only seen this right now. But anyways, the dragon's crazy. If black is willing to memorize tons of only moves to get a draw, sometimes he can do it, but who knows, maybe there's some improvement somewhere in white maybe winning, and that shouldn't be too much of a surprise in general because the dark squares are weak, black made the weaknesses first, and black is trying to prove that he has counterplay. So, to summarize the Topalov dragon, black often takes on d4 instead of knight e5 in order to get a quick pawn storm. Black's pawn storm is just as fast as white's. I'll slow down. Black's pawn storm is just as fast as white's pawn storm because black started first with b5. But the consequence of this is that black has weakened his center control with this exchange knight takes d4, and as a result, white can just play in the center and objectively has better chances in the center after knight d5 and exchanging most of the minor pieces. Now black still has lots of weaknesses on the dark squares, but he hopes that he'll get enough counterplay with typical sacrifices with b4. But white can choose between either capturing the pawn or still continuing the pawn storm with h4, h5, g4, and rook e1 to target the e7 pawn with good chances either way. If black plays concretely, he has enough play to hold the balance, at least in the lines I recommended, but he still needs to play very accurately and is the one on the defensive. I hope that you enjoyed. Feel free to ask if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next chapter.